In 1936, a locked chest belonging to Isaac Newton was auctioned at Sotheby's in London. Inside, among hundreds of unpublished pages, lay a handwritten translation of a text Newton had copied by candlelight. Not a formula for gravity, not a proof of motion, but a short passage attributed to a figure the Egyptians called Thoth. The text described the structure of the universe in fewer than a dozen lines. Newton had returned to it again and again, marking it, underlining it, as though something in its rhythm refused to settle. That passage is known as the Emerald Tablet. Why the man who defined modern physics spent more of his life on this single fragment than on optics is a question no biography has fully closed. Tonight we follow a thread much older than Newton's candle. It stretches from the sands of pre-dynastic Egypt back across a flood that may have ended an entire age, and forward through Greece medieval alchemy, and a strange anonymous document that surfaced online in 2011, before vanishing without explanation. Along the way, we will trace the echoes of Atlantis not as proof of a lost empire, but as a pattern that reappears in places and periods that should share nothing in common. We will move through three layers: the myths, that describe a world before memory, the stones and structures that do not quite fit their official timelines, and the quiet persistence of a single phrase that has crossed every civilization it has touched. None of what follows is certain. Much of it is disputed. Some of it may be nothing more than the human tendency to find shape in randomness, but the consistency is worth sitting with, the way a melody heard faintly from another room is worth pausing for, not because you are sure of the song, but because you recognize something in it you cannot name. The oldest stories humanity tells do not describe beginnings, they describe what came after an ending. Sumerian tablets speak of a world cleansed by water. Hindu texts count the ages of Earth in cycles of creation and dissolution. The Maya recorded previous suns, each one extinguished before the current era began. Greek poets wrote of a golden race that lived before the present order of things, and in Egypt the earliest temple inscriptions refer to a period called Zep Tepi, the first time when beings of knowledge walked among people and taught them the movements of the stars. These accounts span continents that had no known contact with one another. They arise from languages that share no root, yet the architecture of the story is remarkably stable. A world of great understanding existed. It was destroyed suddenly, most often by water, and a small number of teachers survived to carry fragments of that understanding forward. Scholars explain this through shared archetypes, the idea that all human minds produce similar myths under similar pressures. That explanation is reasonable, but it does not account for the specific details that recur: the number of kingdoms, the role of a single keeper of knowledge, the description of a green stone that holds the laws of transformation. Around 12,000 years ago, something did happen to the Earth. Geological cores from Greenland ice sheets record a sudden temperature collapse. Meltwater pulses from collapsing glaciers raised sea levels by meters within decades. Coastlines that had been inhabited for millennia disappeared beneath the ocean. The event aligns roughly with what geologists call the Younger Dryas boundary, a period of abrupt climate reversal, whose cause is still debated. Some researchers point to a comet impact. Others cite the natural oscillation of ocean currents. What is not debated is the scale of the disruption. Entire ecosystems shifted. Human populations that had settled along now submerged coastlines were forced inland. Whatever cultures existed along those edges were erased from the physical record. This is the window into which the Atlantis narrative fits, not comfortably, not provably, but with a kind of quiet alignment that is difficult to dismiss entirely. Plato placed Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Egyptian priests, according to his account, told Solon that the story was already ancient when Egypt was young. The numbers may be symbolic, the geography may be metaphor, but the underlying claim that a sophisticated culture existed before the floodline and did not survive it sits closer to geological possibility than most modern readers assume. And then there is Thoth. In Egyptian tradition, he is the ibis-headed god of writing measurement and the moon. But the oldest references do not describe him as a god at all. They describe him as a teacher, someone who arrived after the first time carrying knowledge of astronomy, geometry, and a system of symbols that would become the foundation of hieroglyphic writing. Later in Greek-speaking Alexandria, he was merged with Hermes to become Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice-great author of the Hermetica, a collection of philosophical texts that influenced everything from Neoplatonism to Renaissance science. The merging of these two figures may be nothing more than cultural syncretism, one civilization absorbing the gods of another, or it may point to something the ancient sources themselves insisted upon, that the teacher was not invented twice, but remembered twice under different names in different ages. At the centre of both traditions sits a single object, a tablet said to be carved from green stone, inscribed with a message so compressed that every line has generated centuries of commentary. Its most famous phrase, as above so below, has been treated as mystical poetry, alchemical formula, and more recently as an early intuition of the fractal symmetry that modern physics finds at every scale of the universe. The tablet's oldest known written version appears in an Arabic manuscript from roughly the 6th or 7th century. But the traditions surrounding it claim a lineage far older one that traces back through Egypt, through the flood, through a world that existed before the one we know. Whether that lineage is real or constructed, the pattern it creates is worth following slowly without conclusion, the way one follows a river not to find its source, but to understand the landscape it has shaped. We begin where the water receded, and where a figure, the legends say, walked east across new sand toward a land the old world had marked for rebirth. The shape of an ending. Greenland's ice remembers what human memory cannot. 2 miles beneath the surface of the ice sheet, trapped in layers compressed over millennia air bubbles, hold a chemical record of every major climate event the planet has experienced. In 1993, when researchers from the Greenland Ice Sheet Project extracted a core reaching back more than 100,000 years, they found something embedded in the layers corresponding to roughly 10,800 BCE, a sharp, almost violent shift. Temperatures that had been gradually warming after the last glacial maximum suddenly reversed. Within the span of a few decades, the northern hemisphere plunged back into near glacial cold. Sea levels, which had been rising steadily as ice melted, surged in irregular pulses. Coastlines that had supported human settlement for thousands of years were swallowed. And then, almost as abruptly, the cold released its grip around 9,700 BCE, and the world warmed again rapidly, chaotically reshaping every landscape it touched. Geologists call this period the Younger Dryas. Its cause remains debated, but the scale of the disruption is not. Whatever happened 12,000 years ago, it was enough to redraw the surface of the Earth. And here is the detail that lingers in the margins of that data. The flooding was not uniform. It came in pulses, meltwater events so sudden that entire river systems reversed direction. The Black Sea, which may have been a freshwater lake at the time, was breached by the Mediterranean, in what some geologists model as a single catastrophic pour. Coastal plains that now lie beneath 40 metres of water across the Sunda Shelf, the Persian Gulf, and the continental shelves of India and North Africa were inundated within generations. For anyone living on those edges, and evidence suggests many early human populations clustered near coastlines, the event would not have felt like a gradual change. It would have felt like the world ending. This is the landscape against which the oldest human stories were shaped, not in comfort, not in stability, but in the aftermath of something enormous. And the stories themselves carry the texture of that aftermath. They do not begin with hope, they begin with water. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerian king list, one of the earliest known historical records, divides all of time into 2 eras, before the flood and after it. The kings who ruled before the flood are assigned reigns lasting tens of thousands of years, numbers so large they have been dismissed as mythological. But the structure of the list is telling. It does not treat the flood as one disaster among many. It treats the flood as the dividing line of history itself. Everything before it belongs to a different order. Everything after it is recovery. Hindu cosmology describes a similar architecture. The Yuga's vast cycles of time move from a golden age of knowledge and harmony down through progressively darker periods. At the end of each great cycle, the world is dissolved and remade. The Matsya Purana tells of Manu, a figure warned by a divine fish to build a vessel before the waters rise. He survives. He carries seeds, sages, and the Vedas, the sacred knowledge, into the next age. The parallels to the Mesopotamian account are structural, not superficial. Both describe a world that functioned at a higher level, a catastrophe that erased it, and a chosen figure who preserved essential knowledge through the destruction. In the highlands of Central America, the popal view of the Quiché Maya speaks of previous creations, worlds fashioned and destroyed by the gods, before the present one was allowed to stand. The beings of those earlier worlds were flawed, some made of mud, some of wood. Each version was wiped away. The implication is that the current world is not the first attempt. It is the latest in a series, each one carrying forward lessons from the failures before it. Greek tradition offers its own version. Hesiod's Works and Days describes 5 ages of humanity: gold, silver, bronze, heroic, and iron, each one diminished from the last. The golden race lived without toil in harmony with the earth. They did not die so much as fade. The present age, the age of iron, is described as the lowest point to time of labour and loss. Plato, writing centuries later, placed Atlantis within this framework, a powerful civilization destroyed by the gods when it lost its virtue, swallowed by the sea in a single day and night. These are not identical stories. Their details differ in ways that reflect the cultures that shaped them. But beneath the surface variation, a skeleton persists, a former world of greater knowledge, a sudden destruction, most often by water, and a narrow thread of survival through which something, a teaching, a text, a memory passes into the next age. Scholars who study comparative mythology call this a universal motif. They attribute it to the shared psychology of human beings processing natural disasters. That explanation is coherent and it may be sufficient, but it does not quite account for the precision of certain recurring elements, the role of a single keeper, the emphasis on preserved knowledge rather than preserved life, and the insistence across unrelated traditions that what was lost was not merely a civilization, but an understanding of how the world itself is structured. Whether these myths describe a real event filtered through millennia of retelling, or whether they reflect a deep pattern in the way humans narrate catastrophe, the emotional architecture is the same. Something enormous preceded us. Something was lost. And something thin, fragile, possibly distorted made it through. It is into this gap between geological evidence and mythological memory that the name Atlantis has been placed, sometimes carelessly, sometimes with more precision than its critics acknowledge. What the traditions actually describe and how closely those descriptions align with what the stones and the ice cores suggest is where the next thread begins to pull. The name behind the water. What did Plato actually say? The question sounds simple, but it leads into a tangle that 24 centuries of commentary have only made thicker. Most people who use the word Atlantis have never read the 2 dialogues, where it appears the Timaeus and the Critias, both written around 360 BCE. In these texts, Plato does not present Atlantis as his own discovery. He places the story in the mouth of Critias, an elderly Athenian who claims to have heard it from his grandfather, who heard it from the statesman Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests at the temple of Neith in Sais. The chain of transmission alone should give us pause. It is 4 generations long before it even reaches Plato's pen, and the Egyptian priests themselves describe the account as ancient in their own time. Plato sets the destruction of Atlantis at roughly 9,000 years, before Solon's visit, a figure that, if taken at face value, places the event around 9,600 BCE. That date, whether by coincidence or by some thread of genuine transmission, falls squarely within the window of the younger Dryas. The Atlantis that Plato describes is not a vague legend. It is strangely specific. He gives it a geography, a large island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is to say beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, facing a continent on the far side of the ocean. He gives it a political structure, a confederation of 10 kingdoms, each ruled by descendants of the god Poseidon, arranged in concentric rings of land and water around a central island. He gives it engineering canals connecting the rings, harbours large enough for massive fleets' walls plated in metals, including one called orichalcum, which Plato describes as glowing like fire and second in value only to gold. He gives it agriculture, ritual and law, and then he gives it a moral arc the Atlanteans began in virtue, but gradually declined, mixing their divine nature with mortal excess, until the gods judged them, and the sea swallowed everything in a single day and night of earthquakes and floods. The Critias breaks off mid-sentence unfinished, as though Plato either lost interest or could not bring himself to complete the destruction. Mainstream scholarship treats the story as allegory. Plato, the argument goes, was constructing a philosophical parable about the corruption of an ideal state, a mirror held up to Athens, a warning about imperial hubris. This reading is reasonable, internally consistent, and supported by the fact that Plato frequently used myth and metaphor to illustrate philosophical points. The allegory interpretation has dominated academic discussion for over a century, and for many classicists the matter is settled. But a small and persistent counter-tradition has never fully accepted that conclusion, and the reasons are not frivolous. Plato himself, through the character of Critias, insists repeatedly that the story is not a myth, but a true account. He has Critias say in the Timaeus that the great advantage of the tale is that it is fact and not fiction. Whether Plato meant this literally, or was simply employing a narrative device, is impossible to know. But the emphasis is unusual for a writer who elsewhere made clear distinctions between myth and argument. There is also the problem of detail. Allegories tend to be general. They sketch outlines and leave the particulars loose so the moral can breathe. Plato's Atlantis, by contrast, is dense with measurements, the dimensions of the central island, the depth of the canals, the distances between the rings of water. These numbers have no obvious allegorical function. They read less like parable and more like the description of a place someone once tried to record. Whether that place existed as described, or whether Plato was elaborating on a genuine but vaguer tradition he received through Solon, remains an open question. The Egyptian priest at Say told Solon something. What that something was stripped of Plato's literary shaping is the gap that has never been convincingly closed. Some researchers have pointed to the concentric ring structure and suggested parallels with the Risha structure in Mauritania, a geological formation in the Western Sahara whose circular ridges and approximate dimensions bear a resemblance to Plato's layout. Others have proposed locations in the Mediterranean, the North Sea, even Antarctica. None of these identifications have achieved consensus, and most professional archaeologists regard the search for a literal Atlantis as a distraction from more productive inquiry. Yet the word itself refuses to disappear. It returns in every generation, attached to new evidence, new theories, new frustrations. And the reason it returns may have less to do with Plato than with the structure beneath his story, the older pattern of a drowned world and a preserved teaching that appears in traditions Plato could not have borrowed from because they existed on continents he did not know about. The 10 Kingdoms, the central island of knowledge, the figure who carries wisdom out of the destruction, these elements recur in sources that have no connection to Greek philosophy. They surface in Hindu, Mesoamerican and West African oral traditions with a consistency that comparative mythology has noted but never fully explained. Plato may have given the lost civilization its most famous name, but the shape of the story was already ancient when he found it. What matters for the thread we are following is not whether Atlantis occupied a specific coordinate on a modern map. What matters is what the tradition claims survived the destruction and who carried it. Because in every version of the story, regardless of culture or continent, the emphasis falls not on the civilization that was lost, but on the knowledge that was saved. And in the Egyptian, telling the figure who saved it is given a name that appears on temple walls, older than any dynasty. That name, and the role attached to it, is where the current turns next. The teacher who did not begin in Egypt. On the walls of the Temple of Horus at Edfu, carved into limestone during the Ptolemaic period, but claiming to reproduce texts far older, there is a series of inscriptions known as the Edfu building texts. They describe the founding of the first sacred mound, the original temple, in a time before the current world had taken its shape. The founders are not called gods in the way later Egyptian religion would use the word. They are called the Shebtiu, a group of builder sages who arrived from across the water after their homeland was destroyed by a great flood. They brought with them the knowledge of sacred architecture, the principles by which a temple could mirror the structure of the cosmos. Among the figures associated with this founding act, one name recurs with particular weight. It is written in hieroglyphs as Jehuti, a name the Greeks would later render as Thoth. But the Edfu texts do not introduce him as a god of the Egyptian pantheon. They introduce him as someone who was already ancient when the first Egyptian stones were laid. The detail is easy to overlook amid the density of the carvings, but it carries an implication that Egyptology has never fully absorbed that the Egyptians themselves regarded Thoth not as their own invention, but as an inheritance from somewhere else. In classical Egyptian theology, Thoth occupies a position unlike any other deity. He is the god of writing, the inventor of hieroglyphs, the measurer of time, the keeper of records, and the judge who weighs the heart of the dead against the feather of Maat. He is depicted with the head of an ibis, or sometimes as a baboon, and his cult centre at Hermopolis was one of the oldest in the Nile Valley. But even within the conventional framework there is something anomalous about Thoth. He does not behave like the other gods. He does not wage wars, seduce mortals, or compete for dominance in the divine hierarchy. His role is structural. He maintains the balance of the universe through knowledge rather than force. The pyramid texts among the oldest religious writings on Earth carved into the burial chambers of 5th and 6th dynasty pharaohs around 2400 BCE refer to Thoth not as a ruler, but as the one who reckons, the one who knows, the one who has counted the heavens and measured the stars. These epithets do not describe a deity of myth. They describe a figure whose function is closer to that of a scientist or an archivist, someone whose power lies entirely in the precision of what he understands. This functional role becomes even more striking when placed alongside traditions that are not Egyptian at all. In Mesoamerica, the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl is described as a bringer of knowledge, writing calendrics, agriculture, and astronomy, who arrived from across the sea after a great destruction. In Sumerian tradition, the 7 Apkallu are sages sent by the god Enki to teach humanity the arts of civilization after the flood. In Hindu mythology, the Saptarishi 7 great sages survive the deluge with Manu and carry the Vedic knowledge into the next age. None of these figures are identical to Thoth. Their mythologies differ in texture, in theology, and cultural specificity, but the structural role is the same in every case. A figure or group of figures who arrive after a catastrophe carrying knowledge that the surviving population does not possess, and who teach that knowledge, systematically establishing the foundations on which the next civilization will be built. The repetition of this pattern across unrelated cultures is one of the most discussed and least resolved questions in comparative mythology. It may reflect a universal human need to attribute the origins of knowledge to a higher source, or it may reflect a genuine memory fractured and refracted through thousands of years of retelling, of a time when knowledge really was delivered from somewhere outside the experience of the people who received it. What sets the Egyptian account apart is its specificity. The Egyptians did not simply claim that Thoth taught them. They claimed he left behind a body of written work. The phrase, "the books of Thoth," appears repeatedly in temple inscriptions and papyri, always with a tone of reverence that suggests something more concrete than metaphor. The Westcar papyrus, dating to around 1600 BCE, tells a story in which a magician seeks a chamber in the temple of Thoth, containing a document written by the god's own hand, a document that reveals the number of the secret chambers in the sanctuary of the sky. The Turin Papyrus, a fragmentary king list from roughly the same period, includes a section listing divine rulers who governed Egypt before the human dynasties began, and Thoth appears among them with a reign measured in thousands of years. These references do not prove that Thoth was a historical figure, but they demonstrate that the Egyptians treated him as one not as an abstraction or a symbol, but as a being who had existed in time, who had walked in the world, who had produced tangible works that could in principle be found. The most consequential of those works, according to the tradition, was not a library of scrolls. It was a single object, a tablet made from a green substance that no later source could identify with certainty. Some texts call it a stone. Others describe it as something between mineral and light, a material that did not behave like anything found in the natural world. The tablet was said to contain in compressed and symbolic form the fundamental laws governing transformation, the processes by which matter changes state, by which consciousness interacts with the physical world, and by which the cycles of creation repeat themselves across ages. Later, Arabic writers would call it the Tabula Smaragdina. Medieval alchemists would call it the Emerald Tablet, but the Egyptian sources, fragmented and elusive as they are, suggest the object was already old when it arrived in the Nile Valley, that it was not made in Egypt but brought there, carried by the same figure who carried the knowledge of the stars, the calendar, and the sacred geometry that would eventually be built into stone. Whether this object existed as a physical artifact or as a metaphor for a body of teaching that was too important to lose is a question the sources do not settle. What they do settle in their own quiet way is the direction of transmission. The knowledge flowed into Egypt from somewhere else, and the figure who carried it did not claim to have created it. He claimed to have preserved it from a place that no longer existed, from an age that the rising waters had already begun to erase. The question of where that place might have been and what the geological record says about the world Thoth is said to have left behind pulls the thread deeper into territory where myth and measurement begin to overlap in ways that are not entirely comfortable for either side. Chem and the geometry of memory. The land Thoth is said to have entered was not yet Egypt. It had no pharaohs, no pyramids, no temples of carved stone. The Nile Valley in the millennia following the Younger Dryas was a place of transition. Marshland still adjusting to new water levels, savannas slowly drying into desert, scattered communities of semi-nomadic herders and early farmers who built with mud brick and reed. Archaeological evidence from sites like Nabta Playa, roughly 100 kilometers west of the modern Nile, in the southern Egyptian desert shows that these communities were not primitive in the way the word is sometimes used. By around 7000 BCE, the people of Nabta Playa had constructed a stone circle aligned with the summer solstice, and with the rising of stars in the belt of Orion, they had established a ritual calendar. They had buried cattle in elaborate stone-lined graves that suggest complex social organization. But they had no writing, no monumental architecture, and no apparent connection to the sophisticated astronomical knowledge that would later appear seemingly fully formed in the earliest dynastic records of Egypt. The gap between what existed at Nabta Playa and what appeared in the First Dynasty is one of the less discussed puzzles of North African archaeology. Something accelerated the development, and the conventional explanations, gradual accumulation influence from Mesopotamia, independent invention account for parts of the picture, but leave a residue of questions that have never been cleanly resolved. The Egyptian tradition itself offers an explanation, though it is one that modern historians treat with caution. The concept of Zep Tepi the first time appears in inscriptions spanning thousands of years from the pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom to the Ptolemaic temple. Reliefs at Dendera and Edfu. It describes a period before the human dynasties when divine beings established the principles of civilization on Egyptian soil. The specific knowledge attributed to this founding era is remarkably consistent across the sources. Astronomy, geometry, the measurement of time, the alignment of structures with celestial bodies, the use of proportion in architecture, and the principles of Ma'at, a concept usually translated as truth or cosmic order, but which functions in the texts more like a description of the underlying structure of reality. These are not the kinds of knowledge one associates with gradual tribal development. They are systemic, interconnected, and abstract in ways that suggest a mature intellectual tradition, rather than an emerging one. The Egyptians did not describe Zep Tepi as a slow dawn. They described it as a transplantation knowledge arriving from elsewhere and taking root in prepared ground. If Thoth was the carrier of that knowledge as the tradition insists, then the method of transmission becomes important. The later mystery schools of Egypt institutions attached to major temples at Heliopolis, Memphis, Thebes, and elsewhere operated on a principle that modern educators would recognize as scaffolded instruction. Knowledge was not given all at once. It was layered, sequenced, and calibrated to the readiness of the student. Initiates progressed through degrees of understanding each level, unlocking access to deeper teachings. The innermost knowledge, according to the tradition, was never written down. It was transmitted orally teacher to student in a chain that the priest believed stretched back to the first time itself. This structure has led some researchers to suggest that the mystery schools were not Egyptian innovations, but continuations of an older pedagogical system, one designed to preserve knowledge across the kind of civilizational collapse that the flood myths describe. The logic is simple. Written records can burn, libraries can be destroyed, but a living chain of transmission encoded in ritual and reinforced by practice can survive disruptions that would erase any archive. If the tradition is accurate, the mystery schools were not schools in the modern sense. They were vessels containers shaped specifically to carry knowledge through dark ages. The physical expression of this knowledge is where the story becomes most difficult to explain away. The Great Pyramid at Giza, built during the 4th dynasty around 2560 BCE, encodes relationships that its builders had no obvious reason to know. The ratio of its perimeter to its height approximates the value of pi to a precision that seems unnecessary for a tomb. Its base is aligned to true north with an accuracy of less than 1/15 of a degree, a precision that was not matched in Europe until the 18th century. The so-called King's Chamber, constructed entirely from granite blocks quarried 600 miles away in Aswan and fitted with joints so tight that a razor blade cannot be inserted between them, produces a resonant frequency that acoustic researchers have measured at approximately 121 Hz, a frequency that falls within the range some studies associate with altered states of consciousness. None of these individual facts prove anything beyond skilled engineering, but taken together they suggest a design philosophy that integrates astronomy, mathematics, acoustics, and material science into a single coherent structure. The question is not whether the ancient Egyptians were capable of remarkable building. They clearly were. The question is where the integrating vision came from the framework that connected these disparate disciplines into a unified architectural language. The conventional answer is that it emerged over centuries of accumulated experience, trial and error refined across generations of builders. That answer is not unreasonable, but it sits uncomfortably beside the fact that some of the most sophisticated constructions in Egypt are also among the oldest. The Osirian at Abydos, a subterranean structure built from enormous granite and sandstone blocks, uses a megalithic style that predates the temples constructed above it by potentially thousands of years. Its masonry resembles nothing else in dynastic Egypt. It resembles instead the Cyclopean stonework found at sites like Sacsayhuaman in Peru, a parallel that may mean nothing, or may mean something that neither conventional archaeology nor alternative history has yet been able to articulate clearly. The stones at both sites are fitted without mortar, cut with a precision that leaves no visible gap, and shaped in interlocking polygonal patterns that distribute seismic stress in ways modern engineers have only recently begun to model. Whether this reflects independent innovation on two continents, or a shared inheritance from a common source, is a question that remains genuinely open and comfortable for those who prefer certainty in either direction. What the Egyptian record does make clear is that the knowledge encoded in these structures was regarded as sacred, not in the sense of being merely religious, but in the sense of being essential, foundational, too important to leave exposed to the erosion of time and the carelessness of future generations. And at the heart of that sacred knowledge, according to the texts, sat the teachings of Thoth teachings that would eventually travel beyond Egypt's borders and take on a new name in a language spoken on the far side of the Mediterranean. The name that crossed the sea. How does a god travel from one civilization to another without losing his purpose? The question sounds theological, but in the case of Thoth, it is largely a question of translation, not just of language, but of cultural expectation of the way one civilization absorbs the sacred figures of another and reshapes them to fit its own architecture of meaning. When Greek-speaking scholars first encountered Egyptian religion in depth, beginning with the conquests of Alexander in the 4th century BCE, and accelerating under the Ptolemaic dynasty that followed, they did not reject the Egyptian gods. They mapped them. They looked for equivalences points where an Egyptian deity's function overlapped with a figure from their own tradition. In most cases, the mapping was loose. Amun became Zeus. Hathor became Aphrodite. Osiris became Dionysus. These identifications were convenient rather than precise, diplomatic rather than theological. But the mapping of Thoth was different. When the Greeks encountered Jehuti, the measurer, the scribe, the keeper of cosmic balance, they did not simply assign him a Greek counterpart. They elevated the result into something new. They called him Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great, and they treated him not as a mythological figure but as a historical one, a sage of incomprehensible antiquity, who had authored a body of work so vast that later writers would attribute 42 books to him, covering everything from astronomy and medicine to theology and the nature of the soul. The city where this synthesis took deepest root was Alexandria, founded by Alexander in 331 BCE at the western edge of the Nile Delta Alexandria, became within a few generations the intellectual centre of the ancient world. Its famous library, or more accurately its network of libraries and research institutions, gathered texts from every culture the Ptolemaic Empire could reach. Greek philosophy sat alongside Egyptian temple records. Babylonian astronomical tables were compared with Indian mathematical treatises. Jewish scripture was translated into Greek for the first time. It was a city built on the premise that knowledge from different traditions could be collected, compared and synthesized into something greater than any single source. And at the heart of this synthesis, attracting scholars from traditions that rarely spoke to one another, was the figure of Hermes Trismegistus and the body of texts attributed to him. The writings that emerge from this environment, collectively known as the Hermetica, are not a single coherent book. They are a collection of dialogues, treatises, and fragments composed over several centuries, probably between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE, though their authors claimed they were transmitting knowledge far older than their own era. The most famous of these texts is the Poemandres, a visionary dialogue in which Hermes receives a revelation about the creation of the cosmos and the nature of the human soul. Its cosmology is dense-layered and startlingly modern, in places describing a universe that emanates from a single source of light and consciousness, a universe in which matter is not separate from mind, but is mind in a denser state. But the passage that would travel farthest, outlasting the library that housed it, and the empire that built it, was not from the Poemandres. It came from a shorter text one whose origins are even more obscure, the Tabulus Maridina, the Emerald Tablet. The earliest surviving version of the Emerald Tablet appears not in Greek, but in Arabic, embedded within a larger work called the Kitab Sir al-Khalika, the Book of the Secret of Creation, attributed to a figure called Balanas, who is generally identified as a pseudonym for Apollonius of Tyana, a 1st century Greek philosopher. The Arabic text claims that Balanas discovered the tablet in a vault beneath a statue of Hermes, clutched in the hands of a corpse seated on a golden throne. The scene has the texture of legend, but the content of the tablet itself has a different quality. It is terse, almost compressed, as though someone had distilled an entire cosmology into a handful of sentences. Its most famous line, "That which is above is like that which is below, and that which is below is like that which is above." To accomplish the miracles of the one thing is not poetry in the decorative sense. It is a statement of structural principle, a claim that the laws governing the largest scales of the universe are mirrored in the smallest, that the macrocosm and the microcosm reflect each other, with a precision that is not metaphorical but operational. For modern readers familiar with fractal geometry, with the self-similar patterns that repeat at every scale in nature, the phrase carries a resonance that its medieval translators could not have anticipated. The problem, and it is a genuine problem, not merely an academic quibble, is provenance. No Greek original of the Emerald Tablet has ever been found. No Egyptian hieroglyphic version exists. The Arabic text is the oldest we have, and it dates to roughly the 6th or 7th century CE, which means the physical evidence places the tablet's composition somewhere in the early medieval period, not in the deep antiquity its content seems to claim. Scholars who approach the text historically see it as a product of the same Alexandrian synthesis that produced the rest of the Hermetica, a creative blending of Egyptian, Greek and Near Eastern thought. Impressive in its philosophical ambition, but not genuinely ancient. This is a defensible position, and it carries the weight of conventional textual scholarship behind it. Yet it does not entirely account for the tablet's persistence. Texts produced in Alexandria were numerous. Most of them vanished. The ones that survived did so because institutions, churches, monasteries, universities chose to preserve them. The Emerald Tablet had no such institutional support. It survived despite being marginal, despite being heretical in a Christian context, despite offering no obvious utility to the political or religious powers that controlled the flow of written knowledge through the medieval world. It survived because individuals working outside official channels copied it, translated it, memorized it, and passed it forward with a tenacity that suggests they believed it contained something too important to lose. That tenacity would find its most intense expression in a tradition that took the tablet's instructions literally, not as philosophy, not as theology, but as a practical guide to transforming the physical world. The alchemists who carried this tradition through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance did not treat the Emerald Tablet as an artifact of intellectual history. They treated it as a manual, and what they attempted with its instructions would reshape the boundary between science and mysticism in ways that have never been fully untangled. The laboratories where that work unfolded, and the strange results it occasionally produced, belong to the chapter that follows. The weight of reasonable doubt. It would be dishonest to continue without pausing here. The narrative we have followed from ice cores to flood myths, from Plato's Atlantis to the Edfu building, texts from Thoth to Hermes Trismegistus to the Emerald Tablet has a seductive coherence. Each piece seems to confirm the one before it. Each tradition appears to echo another across distances that should make such echoes impossible. The pattern feels real. But feeling real and being real are not the same thing, and the history of human thought is littered with patterns that dissolved the moment they were examined with sufficient rigour. Before we follow this thread any further, we owe the story the discipline of examining what might be wrong with it. The first and most fundamental objection is methodological. When researchers look for connections between ancient cultures, they tend to find them not because the connections exist, but because the human mind is exceptionally skilled at detecting patterns even in randomness. Psychologists call this apophenia. It is the same cognitive tendency that makes us see faces in clouds, hear meaningful words in static, and find constellations in scattered stars. Every civilization that developed agriculture also developed flood myths, and the reason may be far simpler than a shared memory of a global catastrophe. Agricultural societies settle near rivers, rivers flood, floods destroy everything a community has built. The resulting trauma becomes the most important story a culture tells about itself, a story of loss, survival, and renewal that takes on cosmic significance precisely because the experience is so devastating and so universal. The structural similarities between flood myths may reflect not a common origin, but a common experience independently processed by human minds that share the same cognitive architecture. This explanation is not glamorous. It does not hint at lost civilizations or secret tablets, but it is parsimonious, and in science parsimony carries weight. The second objection concerns the Emerald Tablet specifically. The claim that its teachings trace back to a pre-flood civilization rests on a chain of attribution that when examined closely has no verifiable links. The oldest physical text is Arabic, from roughly the 7th century CE. Everything before that, the Greek Hermes, the Egyptian Thoth, the Atlantean origin, exists only as claim, not as evidence. Each culture that adopted the tablet attributed it to a figure older than itself, creating a recursive chain of authority that stretches backward into an unprovable past. This is a well-documented pattern in the history of religious and esoteric literature. Texts gain authority by claiming ancient origins. The Dead Sea Scrolls community attributed their writings to Enoch. Medieval alchemists attributed their work to Hermes. Renaissance forgers attributed entire libraries to figures who may never have existed. The Emerald Tablet fits comfortably within this tradition of pseudepigraphic attribution, the practice of attaching a famous name to a text in order to elevate its status. The content of the tablet may be genuinely profound, but profundity does not require antiquity. A brilliant thinker in 7th century Baghdad could have composed it from the philosophical materials available in that era: Neoplatonism, Gnostic cosmology, Aristotelian natural philosophy, without any need for a pre-flood source. The simplest explanation is that someone did exactly that. The third objection is archaeological, and it strikes at the heart of the Atlantis narrative. Despite more than a century of searching, no physical evidence of Atlantis has ever been found. No ruins, no artifacts, no inscriptions, no material culture of any kind that can be definitively linked to the civilization Plato described. Underwater surveys of the regions most frequently proposed as Atlantis candidates: the mid-Atlantic ridge, the coast of Spain, the Risha structure in Mauritania. The seafloor around Santorini have produced interesting geological features, but nothing that constitutes evidence of a complex human society. The absence of evidence is not, as the saying goes, evidence of absence. But in archaeology, where the discipline depends on material remain sustained, absence over decades of investigation does carry evidential weight. We have found hominin footprints preserved in volcanic ash from 3.6 million years ago. We have found microscopic traces of ancient meals in the dental calculus of Neanderthal teeth. The archaeological record is remarkably sensitive. If a civilization of the complexity Plato described had existed 12,000 years ago, its complete invisibility in the material record would be at minimum extraordinary, requiring explanations that invoke unprecedented levels of destruction, submersion, or both. These three objections, cognitive bias in pattern recognition, pseudepigraphic attribution of ancient texts, and the absence of material evidence for Atlantis, are serious. They are not the complaints of people who lack imagination. They are the concerns of disciplines that have learned through centuries of error that the most compelling stories are often the least reliable, and that the desire to believe can corrupt the ability to evaluate. Any honest engagement with the material we have been exploring must hold these objections in one hand while holding the patterns in the other, and resist the temptation to close either fist. And yet, when the objections have been given their full weight, a residue remains. It is not proof. It is not even strong evidence in the forensic sense. But it is a discomfort, a set of questions that the skeptical framework acknowledges but does not resolve. Why do the oldest Egyptian structures display a sophistication that does not appear to develop gradually from simpler predecessors? Why does the astronomical knowledge encoded in sites like Nabta Playa and the Giza Plateau exceed what the communities of those periods would have needed for any practical purpose? Why does the same phrase as above so below surface in traditions that had no plausible means of contact? Why does the figure of the post-flood teacher appear with such structural consistency in mythologies separated by oceans? Each of these questions has a conventional answer. The conventional answers are not wrong, but neither are they complete. They explain the pieces without quite explaining the pattern, the way a description of individual notes can be technically accurate without capturing why the sequence sounds like a melody. It may be that the pattern is an illusion, a melody heard only because we want to hear it. It may be that the gaps in the conventional account will be filled by future discoveries that require no recourse to lost civilizations. It may also be that something genuinely old is pressing against the edges of what the current framework can accommodate, and that the discomfort we feel is not a flaw in our reasoning but a signal that the map is smaller than the territory. The story does not ask us to decide. It asks only that we continue with our eyes open in both directions toward the evidence that supports the pattern and toward the evidence that resists it. What the alchemists did with this same tension, and how they transformed an ancient philosophical fragment into a practical obsession that consumed some of the finest minds in European history, is where the thread picks up again. The furnace and the formula. In a narrow street in medieval Prague, sometime during the late 14th century, a man whose name survives only in fragments, possibly Jan, possibly Johannes, possibly an alias chosen to protect his family from the attention of the church, sealed himself inside a workshop and did not emerge for 3 years. His neighbours knew he was an alchemist. They could smell the sulphur. They could hear the bellows working through the night. They could see through the cracks in his shuttered windows a faint glow that did not behave like candlelight. When he finally opened his door, he was thinner, older, and in possession of a manuscript he claimed contained the true interpretation of the Emerald Tablet. He showed it to no one. Within a year he had disappeared entirely, and the manuscript, if it existed, has never surfaced. This story, recorded in a 16th century collection of alchemical lore, may be apocryphal, but it captures something true about the era. By the late Middle Ages, the Emerald Tablet had become the most pursued text in Europe, and the pursuit was consuming lives. The transmission route by which the tablet's words reached European alchemists is itself a remarkable story of cultural survival. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Hermetica and its associated texts largely vanished from European consciousness. The Christian Church, which controlled nearly all literate culture in the West, had little use for pagan philosophy, and even less for texts that claimed the universe could be understood and manipulated through principles outside divine revelation. But the texts did not disappear. They migrated east and south into the Islamic world, where scholars working in Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba translated Greek and Egyptian philosophical works into Arabic with a thoroughness that European institutions would not match for centuries, It was in this context that the Kitab Sir al-Kalika preserved the Emerald Tablet's text, embedding it within a larger cosmological framework that Arab alchemists, practitioners of alchemia, from which the English word alchemy derives, treated as both philosophical and operational. The Arab alchemists did not merely study the tablet, they experimented with it. Jabir ibn Hayyan, writing in the 8th century, developed a sophisticated system of chemical practice grounded in the principle that all metals were composed of sulfur and mercury in varying proportions, and that the proper manipulation of these principles could achieve transmutation. His work was rigorous, methodical, and influential, and it was built explicitly on the Emerald Tablet's central claim that what is above reflects what is below, that the structure of the cosmos is mirrored in the behaviour of matter. When this knowledge re-entered Europe, it came through the libraries of Islamic Spain, through the translation schools of Toledo and Palermo, where Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars worked side by side converting Arabic texts into Latin. The Emerald Tablet was among the first to be translated, appearing in Latin by the 12th century, in a version attributed to Hugo of Santala. From that point forward, it spread through European intellectual culture with a speed that suggests it was filling a hunger that the prevailing Christian framework had left unsatisfied. The hunger was not merely for knowledge, it was for a particular kind of knowledge that unified the spiritual and the material, that treated the physical world not as fallen or corrupt, but as a living text that could be read, understood, and worked with. The tablet offered exactly this. Its compressed language described a universe in which transformation was the fundamental law, in which matter and consciousness participated in the same processes, and in which the practitioner who understood these processes could in principle accelerate them. The great work, the opus magnum, was the name alchemists gave to this acceleration. Its outward goal was the creation of the philosopher's stone, a substance capable of transmuting base metals into gold, and according to some traditions of healing any disease and extending life indefinitely. But the literature of alchemy makes clear that the physical stone was understood by serious practitioners as the visible expression of an inner transformation, a purification of the alchemist's own consciousness that mirrored the purification of matter in the furnace. This dual nature of the great work, simultaneously physical and spiritual laboratory, practice and meditative discipline, is what makes alchemy so difficult to categorize. It is not science in the modern sense because it does not separate the observer from the experiment. It is not religion because it insists on physical results. It is not philosophy because it demands practical engagement with material substances. It occupies a space that the modern world has largely forgotten how to think about, a space where the boundaries between inner experience and outer reality are treated not as absolute, but as permeable. And at the centre of that space, functioning as both origin and compass, sat the Emerald Tablet. Every major alchemical text references it. Every serious alchemist studied it. Roger Bacon quoted it. Albertus Magnus commented on it. Paracelsus, the 16th century physician, who revolutionized European medicine by insisting that disease had chemical causes and chemical cures, grounded his entire therapeutic philosophy in hermetic principles derived from the tablet. Even those who dismissed alchemy as fraud or delusion acknowledged the tablet's centrality to the tradition. It was the axis around which the entire discipline revolved. But the most unexpected figure to fall under its influence was the one least associated with mysticism in the public imagination. Isaac Newton, born in 1642, is remembered as the architect of classical physics, the man who described gravity, codified the laws of motion, and invented calculus. What is far less known is that Newton's private papers, sealed after his death, and not fully examined until the 20th century, reveal a man consumed by alchemical research. He wrote over 1 million words on the subject, more than he devoted to physics and mathematics combined. He copied the Emerald Tablet by hand. He cross-referenced its language with biblical prophecy, with the dimensions of Solomon's temple, and with his own experimental observations of chemical reactions. He did not approach the tablet as a curiosity. He approached it as someone who believed it encoded genuine knowledge about the forces holding the universe together, forces he had partially described with mathematics, but suspected extended far beyond what equations could capture. The economist John Maynard Keynes, who purchased a large portion of Newton's alchemical manuscripts at auction, in 1936 wrote afterward that Newton was not the first of the age of reason, but the last of the magicians. The phrase has become famous, but its implications are rarely followed to their conclusion. If the mind that discovered gravity also believed the Emerald Tablet contained operational truth, then either Newton was profoundly mistaken about the tablet, or we are profoundly mistaken about what the tablet contains. Both possibilities deserve more discomfort than they typically receive. What Newton sought in those candlelit hours, and what a strange anonymous text published centuries later would claim to finally reveal, is where the thread leads next. The anonymous manuscript. On a Tuesday in March 2011, a PDF file appeared on an obscure internet forum dedicated to esoteric philosophy. It had no author name, no publisher, no ISBN, no institutional affiliation of any kind. The file was 165 pages long, plainly formatted with no illustrations and no decorative elements. Its title was The Book of Aquarius, and its opening line read, "The purpose of this book is to release the secret of the Philosopher's Stone." The sentence was not hedged with qualifiers. It was not dressed in allegory. It was a flat, direct claim, the kind that in any other context would have been dismissed immediately as the work of a crank. But what followed that opening line was not the rambling of an amateur. It was a methodical, closely argued text that cited dozens of classical alchemical sources, cross-referenced their symbolic language with unusual precision, and arrived at a conclusion that no previous alchemical author had stated so plainly. The great work described in the Emerald Tablet was not a metaphor. It was a physical process, and it could be performed by anyone with patience, basic equipment, and a single starting material that the author identified as the most common substance the human body produces. The reaction was immediate and divided. On forums dedicated to Hermeticism and alchemy, the book generated hundreds of pages of discussion within weeks. Some readers dismissed it as satire and elaborate joke at the expense of a community that took its symbols too seriously. Others recognized the depth of the source material and began to take the claims seriously, or at least seriously enough to investigate. What made the book difficult to dismiss outright was not its conclusion, but its scholarship. The author demonstrated a familiarity with alchemical literature that would have required years of dedicated study. He quoted Artephius Flamel, Sendivogius, and Philalethes figures, whose works are not easily accessible and whose symbolic language is notoriously resistant to interpretation. He compared passages across centuries, identified consistent themes beneath shifting metaphors, and argued that the classical alchemists had all described the same process using different symbolic vocabularies, deliberately obscuring a procedure that was at its core remarkably simple. The simplicity was the provocation. Alchemy's reputation rests on its complexity, its layered symbols, its contradictory instructions, its apparent delight in confusion. The Book of Aquarius argued that the confusion was intentional, a protective mechanism designed to prevent the uninitiated from accessing knowledge that the alchemists believed was genuinely dangerous. Strip away the symbolic armor the author claimed, and the underlying process is straightforward, though it requires extraordinary patience. The method described involved collecting the starting material, sealing it in glass, and subjecting it to a cycle of gentle heating and cooling that lasted, depending on the interpretation, between 1 and 3 years. During this period, the substance was said to pass through a series of colour changes: black, white, yellow, and finally red. The red stage, according to the text, produced the Philosopher's Stone. Within months, a small but dedicated community of experimenters began attempting the process. They posted photographs of their equipment: simple glass flasks, sand baths, temperature controllers. They documented colour changes, unexpected residues, and crystalline formations that appeared at intervals consistent with the book's predictions. None of these results constituted proof. The photographs could have been fabricated. The residues could have had mundane chemical explanations. But the consistency of the reports coming from individuals in different countries, with no apparent coordination, created an atmosphere of cautious fascination. Some experimenters reported secondary effects that were harder to categorize: unusually vivid dreams, periods of heightened focus, a sense of emotional clarity that they had not anticipated and could not easily attribute to placebo. These reports echoed in a quieter register, the claims made by medieval alchemists who described the great work as transforming the practitioner as much as the substance. The parallel was difficult to ignore even for skeptics who followed the discussions out of curiosity rather than belief, and then without explanation the project collapsed. The website hosting the Book of Aquarius went offline. The associated forum disappeared. Archived copies of the pages were removed from mirror sites. The anonymous author, who had been actively participating in discussions and clarifying procedures, stopped posting entirely. No farewell message was left. No explanation was offered. The disappearance was so thorough that some participants initially suspected a technical failure, but as weeks turned into months with no restoration, a different set of theories emerged. Some speculated that the author had received legal threats. Others suggested that a government agency had intervened. Others proposed that the author had simply lost interest or become frightened by the attention. The most dramatic theory, whispered rather than argued, was that someone in the experimental community had succeeded, and that the silence was the only rational response to a success whose implications no one was prepared to manage. None of these explanations can be verified. The Book of Aquarius remains available through unofficial channels copied and redistributed by individuals who preserved the text before the original site vanished. It continues to attract readers, and small communities of experimenters still discuss its methods in private forums. But the original project, with its atmosphere of open collaboration and its promise of transparency, is gone. What remains is a question that the book's disappearance made more pointed rather than less. If the Emerald Tablet's instructions were genuinely practical, if the great work was not merely a spiritual metaphor but a physical procedure with measurable results, then the pattern of concealment that has surrounded the tablet for centuries takes on a different character. It becomes not a failure of transmission, but a deliberate strategy, a recurring decision by those who possess the knowledge to withdraw it from circulation at the moment it begins to spread too widely. Whether that pattern reflects wisdom, fear, or something else entirely is a question the alchemists never answered and the anonymous author chose not to address. But the pattern itself, knowledge surfacing, attracting attention, and then retreating into silence, is older than the Book of Aquarius. It is older than the medieval alchemists. It is if the traditions are to be believed as old as the tablet itself, and it raises a possibility that sits uncomfortably between conspiracy and caution, that certain kinds of knowledge may carry their own restrictions not imposed from outside, but built into the nature of what is being transmitted. The next chapter does not resolve this tension. It follows the tablet's echo into a different kind of evidence, not textual but structural, not written in words but carved into stone, across landscapes that should share nothing in common. The geometry that should not repeat. A block of granite sits inside the Serapeum at Saqqara, roughly 20 miles south of the Giza Plateau. It is one of 24 massive stone boxes discovered inside a network of underground tunnels carved into the bedrock beneath the desert. Each box weighs approximately 70 tons. Each lid weighs an additional 30. The surfaces are polished to a flatness that, when measured with modern optical equipment, deviates by less than 0.02 of an inch across their entire span, a tolerance that modern manufacturing achieves only with computer-guided machinery. The corners are sharp. The interior angles are precise to a degree that suggests not hand finishing but something closer to engineered milling. Official Egyptology attributes these boxes to the burial of Apis bulls during the New Kingdom and late period, and the attribution may well be correct in terms of their later use. But the precision of the stonework raises a question that the burial explanation does not address. Why would a container for a sacred bull require tolerances that exceed the specifications of modern submarine periscopes? The skill required to produce these surfaces in granite, one of the hardest common stones on Earth, implies either a tooling technology that has not been identified in the Egyptian archaeological record, or a level of craft so far beyond practical necessity that its purpose must have been something other than containment. This is not an isolated anomaly. Across the Egyptian landscape, and increasingly across landscapes on other continents, researchers have catalogued instances of stonework whose precision seems disproportionate to its apparent function. At Abydos, the Osirian's granite blocks are fitted with a tightness that leaves no room for mortar, and no visible gap between joints, using a polygonal interlocking style that distributes structural stress in ways that modern seismic engineering has only recently formalized. At Giza, the casing stones that once covered the Great Pyramid, a few of which survive at the base, were cut with joints, measuring less than 1/50th of an inch, filled with a cement so thin and so strong that it has outlasted the stones themselves in some cases. At Pumapunku in the Bolivian Altiplano, at an elevation of nearly 13,000 feet, blocks of andesite, a volcanic stone harder than granite, have been cut into interlocking H shapes, with flat surfaces, right angles and drill holes whose regularity suggests standardized production. The site is dated by mainstream archaeology to approximately 536 CE, though some researchers argue for a significantly earlier date, based on the geological context and the depth of sediment covering the ruins when they were first excavated. Whatever the date, the precision is difficult to reconcile with the tools available to the Tiwanaku civilization that is credited with building it. The pattern extends further. At Sacsayhuaman, above the city of Cusco in Peru, a wall of enormous limestone blocks, some weighing over 100 tons, has been fitted together without mortar in a style that mirrors the Osirian's polygonal masonry with an exactness that has troubled researchers since the site was first studied by Western archaeologists in the 19th century. The blocks are not rectangular. They are irregular polygons, each one shaped to interlock with its neighbours like pieces of a three-dimensional puzzle. The joints are so tight that a sheet of paper cannot be inserted between them. The wall has survived centuries of earthquakes that destroyed Spanish colonial buildings constructed on top of it. The engineering is not merely impressive. It is optimized for seismic resistance in a way that implies an understanding of stress distribution that was not formalized in Western engineering until the 20th century. The conventional explanation that the Inca developed this technique independently through centuries of trial and error is plausible. Cultures do develop sophisticated technologies without outside instruction. But the specific convergence of technique, polygonal jointing, extreme surface precision, megalithic scale, seismic optimization, absence of mortar appearing in Egypt and Peru in structures separated by thousands of miles and potentially thousands of years is a convergence that independent invention does not comfortably explain. It is the kind of detail that sits quietly in the academic literature, acknowledged but not pursued, because pursuing it leads into territory that the current framework is not equipped to map. The astronomical dimension adds another layer. The alignment of the three pyramids at Giza with the three stars of Orion's belt, first proposed by Robert Bauval in the early 1990s, remains controversial among Egyptologists, some of whom dispute the precision of the correlation and the assumptions underlying its interpretation. But even critics of the Orion correlation acknowledge that the Egyptians possessed astronomical knowledge of remarkable sophistication. The alignment of the Great Pyramid's base to true north, the orientation of its internal passages towards specific stars at specific epochs, and the encoding of astronomical ratios in its proportions are not contested. What is contested is whether these alignments are deliberate expressions of a unified cosmological vision or incidental byproducts of practical surveying techniques. The distinction matters because one interpretation implies engineering skill alone, while the other implies something deeper, a design philosophy that treats architecture as a mirror of the heavens, an embodiment in stone of the principle that what is above corresponds to what is below. If the latter interpretation is correct, then the Great Pyramid is not merely a feat of construction. It is a physical expression of the Emerald Tablet's central teaching, built into the landscape at a scale that was designed to outlast every other form of record. Nabta Playa complicates the picture further. This stone circle in the southern Egyptian desert, dated to approximately 7000 BCE, aligns not only with the summer solstice but with the rising positions of stars in Orion's belt at that epoch. The community that built it left no written records, no monumental architecture, and no evidence of the kind of centralized society typically associated with astronomical observation at this level of precision. The circle is small, modest in construction, and easy to overlook. But the knowledge it encodes is not modest. It implies that someone in that community understood the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that shifts the position of stars over a cycle of approximately 25,920 years. This is not knowledge that a pastoral community arrives at through casual observation. It requires generations of systematic sky-watching, careful record-keeping and a mathematical framework for predicting celestial positions centuries into the future. The question of where that framework came from is one that the archaeological record at Nabta Playa does not answer. The stones are there. The alignments are measurable. The knowledge they imply is real. But the path by which that knowledge reached a semi-nomadic community in the pre-dynastic Sahara remains for now an open corridor leading backward into an era that has left almost no other trace. It is in these silences, the gaps between what the stones demonstrate and what the historical record can explain, that the oldest traditions find their foothold. And it is in one of those silences, in the space between what the body knows and what the mind has forgotten, that the next thread of the story takes root not in stone, but in the quiet claims of traditions that believed the human body itself carried a memory older than civilization. The fire! Inside the body. What did the oldest medical traditions mean when they spoke of a luminous substance hidden within the human body? The question sounds mystical, but the language used to describe it across cultures that had no means of communication with one another is remarkably clinical. In the Ayurvedic texts of ancient India, the Karika Samhita and the Sushruta Samhita, compiled in their current form around the 1st centuries BCE, but claiming origins far older, there is a substance called ojas. It is described as the finest product of digestion, the ultimate refinement of everything the body consumes, distilled through 7 successive stages of tissue transformation, until it becomes a luminous, subtle essence that resides near the heart. Ojas is not metaphorical in these texts. It is given a quantity approximately half a handful in a healthy adult. It is given physical characteristics slightly reddish, cool, smooth. It is given a function, the maintenance of immunity vitality, and the coherence of consciousness itself. When ojas is abundant, the texts say the body resists disease, the mind remains clear, and the individual radiates a quality that others can perceive but not easily name. When ojas is depleted, illness follows cognition fragments and life force diminishes. The parallel in Chinese medical philosophy is Jing, one of the 3 treasures, described in Taoist internal alchemy alongside Qi and Shen. Jing is understood as the foundational essence, the deep reserve of vitality inherited at birth and gradually spent over the course of a lifetime. It is stored in the kidneys, according to the tradition, and its preservation is the primary concern of longevity practices that have been refined over millennia. Like ojas, Jing is not treated as an abstraction. It is described in physiological terms associated with specific organs, specific symptoms of depletion, and specific methods of conservation and refinement. The Taoist alchemical tradition goes further, describing a process by which Jing can be transformed through breath meditation and precise internal practices into Qi, and Qi into Shen, which is understood as pure spiritual radiance. The terminology differs from the Indian system, but the architecture is identical, a raw essence progressively refined through stages of transformation, culminating in a luminous substance that transcends ordinary biological function. The Western alchemical tradition used different language but described the same structure, with an insistence that suggests more than coincidence. The prima materia, the first matter, was the starting point of the great work. Alchemists described it as something common, something overlooked, something present everywhere but recognized by almost no one. They called it by dozens of names: the green lion, the philosophical mercury, the water that does not wet the hands, and each name was a veil designed to simultaneously reveal and conceal its identity. But the process they described for working with it follows the same trajectory found in the Indian and Chinese systems: a base substance subjected to repeated cycles of purification, passing through stages of transformation marked by specific colours and qualities, until it becomes something radically different from what it was: something luminous, potent and capable of effecting changes that the original substance could not. The Book of Aquarius, centuries later, would argue that all these traditions were describing the same material and the same process in different symbolic vocabularies. Whether or not that argument holds the structural correspondence is striking enough to warrant attention rather than dismissal. What makes this convergence particularly difficult to set aside is its specificity. If 3 unrelated traditions had simply claimed that the human body contained something special, the overlap could be attributed to universal self-regard, the natural tendency of every culture to believe that human beings are more than mere flesh. But the traditions do not stop at the general claim. They describe specific stages of refinement. They identify specific physiological locations. They prescribe specific practices for conservation and transformation. And they arrive independently at the same end point, a substance that glows, that enhances cognition, that resists decay, and that interacts with consciousness in ways that the surrounding medical frameworks do not fully explain. The probability that three isolated traditions would converge on the same multi-stage transformative process by chance is a question that statistical analysis has not been asked to address, largely because the subject matter falls outside the boundaries of what institutional science considers worth investigating. But the pattern is there recorded in texts that predate modern contact between these civilizations by centuries or millennia, and it refuses to dissolve under scrutiny, even if it also refuses to submit to proof. The Emerald Tablet's language maps onto this convergence with uncomfortable precision. Its description of the one thing separated from the earth by fire, rising from the lower to the upper, and descending again to integrate the powers of both reads, less like cosmological poetry, when placed alongside the Taoist sequence of Jing to Shi to Shen, or the Ayurvedic progression from gross tissue to subtle ojas. It reads like a compressed description of the same process, stripped of cultural specificity and reduced to its essential mechanics. Some researchers have suggested that this is exactly what the tablet was designed to be, not a product of any single tradition, but a formula so fundamental that it could be recognized by any culture that had independently discovered the same principles. Others argue that the resemblance is superficial, that the human mind naturally gravitates toward narratives of purification and ascent, and that finding the same pattern in different traditions tells us more about cognitive universals than about shared ancient knowledge. Both positions have merit. Neither can be conclusively established with the evidence currently available. But there is one additional detail that complicates the dismissal. In each of these traditions, Indian, Chinese, and Western alchemical, the practice of refinement is described as dangerous when attempted without proper guidance. The Ayurvedic texts warn that improper manipulation of ojas can destabilize the mind. Taoist masters caution that forcing the transformation of Jing without adequate preparation can cause physical illness and psychological disintegration. The alchemists, with centuries of failed experiments behind them, encoded warnings throughout their literature about the risks of approaching the great work with impure intention or insufficient understanding. This convergence of caution, the shared insistence that the knowledge is real, but the practice is perilous, echoes the oldest claims about the Emerald Tablet itself, that it was hidden not because it was false, but because it was powerful, and that power without readiness produces destruction rather than transformation. Whether the inner fire described by these traditions is a physiological reality, awaiting scientific confirmation, a sophisticated metaphor for psychological development, or a genuine remnant of knowledge transmitted from an age before recorded history, the thread it traces through human culture is unbroken. And it leads, as all the threads in this story eventually do, toward a question that the final chapters must confront not whether the ancient knowledge was real, but whether the world that is now emerging is the one the old tradition said would come. The cycle that remembers itself. Every 25,920 years, the Earth completes one full wobble on its axis. This is not speculation. It is measurable astronomy confirmed by centuries of observation and refined by modern instrumentation to a precision of a few decades. The phenomenon is called the precession of the equinoxes, and its effects are subtle but cumulative. Over the course of this cycle, the position of the sunrise on the spring equinox drifts slowly backward through the constellations of the zodiac, spending roughly 2,160 years in each sign before moving to the next. The pole star changes. The celestial coordinates of every fixed star shift. The sky that a civilization uses to navigate a plant to mark its festivals and orient its temples gradually becomes a different sky, so gradually that no single human lifetime can perceive the drift, but so relentlessly that any culture tracking the stars over centuries must eventually confront the fact that the heavens are not fixed. They are turning slowly on a wheel whose full rotation takes longer than any known civilization has lasted. The striking thing is not that modern astronomy understands precession, it is that ancient sources appear to have understood it as well long before the Greek astronomer Hipparchus is traditionally credited with its discovery around 127 BCE. The Vedic texts of India reference a cycle of ages whose total duration 4,320,000 years is a multiple of the precessional number 25,920 multiplied by specific factors that scholars of archaeastronomy have argued are not accidental. The Norse tradition describes a hall called Valhalla, with 540 doors through each of which 800 warriors pass, yielding a total of 432,000, the same base figure scaled by a factor of 10. The Mesopotamian king lists assigned reigns to pre-flood rulers that when totaled produce multiples of the same number. Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von de Chend in their 1969 study, Hamlet's Mill, catalogued dozens of such numerical correspondences across cultures and argued that they represented fragments of a single astronomical tradition, a tradition encoding processional knowledge in myth, distributed across civilizations that had no other apparent connection. The book was controversial when it was published, and remained so dismissed by some scholars as numerological overreach, but acknowledged by others as raising questions that conventional diffusion theory cannot easily resolve. The numbers at minimum are there. Whether they got there by coincidence, by independent observation, or by inheritance from a common source is a question that remains genuinely unsettled. If the precession was known to cultures far older than Hipparchus, the implications are significant. Tracking precession requires not just sky watching, but record-keeping across many generations, mathematical modelling of celestial motion, and an intellectual framework capable of conceptualizing time in cycles that dwarf human experience. These are not the capacities of simple agricultural communities observing the seasons. They are the capacities of a mature astronomical tradition, one that either developed independently in multiple locations, which is possible, but unlikely given the specificity of the numbers, or was transmitted from an earlier source that no longer survives in the historical record. The Emerald Tablet's insistence that what is above mirrors what is below gains a different texture when placed in this context. If the ancients truly understood the great precessional cycle, they understood that the heavens move in patterns that repeat, that the sky itself is cyclical, and that the ages of the earth are governed by a rhythm as precise and as impersonal as the turning of a wheel. The implication is not mystical, it is structural. The cosmos operates on cycles, and those cycles shape not only the position of stars, but the conditions under which civilizations rise and fall. The ancient traditions make this connection explicit. The Hindu Yuga system divides the precessional cycle into 4 ages of declining virtue and increasing chaos from the golden Satya Yuga to the dark Kali Yuga. The Greek model of gold, silver, bronze and iron ages follows the same descending arc. The Mesoamerican long count calendar measures time in units whose relationships to the precessional cycle have been debated but never entirely dismissed, and the Egyptian concept of Zep Tepi the first time is placed at a point in the precessional cycle when the constellation of Leo rose with the sun at the spring equinox, an alignment that last occurred around 10,500 BCE. Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock have argued that the Sphinx, whose leonine body faces due east toward the equinox sunrise, was designed to mark this specific precessional moment, a claim that mainstream Egyptology rejects on the grounds that the Sphinx is conventionally dated to the reign of Khafra around 2500 BCE. But the geological work of Robert Schoch, a geologist at Boston University, has complicated this dating by identifying patterns of water erosion on the Sphinx enclosure walls that he argues are consistent with prolonged rainfall that the region last experienced before approximately 5000 BCE and possibly much earlier. The erosion evidence does not prove that the Sphinx is 12,000 years old, but it suggests that the conventional date may be too recent, and that the monument's origins may reach back into a period that the current archaeological framework does not fully cover. If the cycles described in these traditions are more than metaphor, if they reflect a genuine understanding of the rhythmic nature of time as expressed through astronomical observation, then the ancient warnings about the turning of ages carry a weight that is not merely philosophical. They describe a pattern in which civilizations reach a peak of material sophistication, lose contact with the deeper knowledge that sustained their rise and collapse under the weight of their own imbalance. The pattern is not destiny. The traditions are careful to distinguish between the turning of the cycle, which cannot be prevented, and the response of the civilization within it, which can be chosen. The Emerald Tablet in this reading is not a relic of nostalgia for a vanished age. It is an instrument of navigation, a set of principles designed to help a civilization recognize where it stands in the cycle and what kind of knowledge it will need to cross the threshold without repeating the errors of the ages that came before. Whether this reading is correct or whether it is simply the most recent in a long line of human attempts to find order in the sweep of history depends on evidence that has not yet fully surfaced. But the question of what that evidence might look like and whether the present moment carries the signature of a turning point is where the final thread of this story gathers itself for the last time. The eighth silence. There is a particular quality to the hour just before dawn, when the sky is no longer dark but not yet light. The stars have faded but the sun has not appeared. The world holds its breath in a space that belongs to neither night nor day. Ancient traditions gave this interval a name. The Egyptians called it the hour of becoming. The Vedic texts called it Brahma Muhurta, the creator's moment. Across cultures that measured time with a precision, we are only beginning to appreciate this interval was considered sacred not because of what it contained, but because of what it permitted. It was the threshold between two states, the seam where one condition ended and another had not yet declared itself. And in that seam, the old teachers said transformation was possible in ways that the settled hours of day or night did not allow. If the pattern traced through these chapters carries any coherence at all, then we are living in something like that hour. Not the catastrophic final moment of a dying age and not the confident first light of a new one, but the interval between the pause in which the shape of what comes next has not yet been fixed. The traditions we have followed describe this pause with a consistency that is worth sitting with, even if it cannot be proved. They say that when an age approaches its turning, certain things begin to surface. Old knowledge reappears in unexpected places. Discoveries are made that do not fit the existing framework. Structures of thought that once seemed permanent begin to loosen. And individuals scattered, uncoordinated, following no single leader or doctrine, begin to sense that something beneath the surface of ordinary life is shifting. Not violently, not dramatically, but with the slow inevitability of a tide that has already turned even though the water has not yet moved. The 20th and 21st centuries have produced a strange accumulation of such moments. Quantum mechanics revealed a universe in which the observer and the observed are not separable, a finding that unsettled physics and has never been fully reconciled with the classical model of an objective, observer-independent reality. The principle sounds remarkably like the Emerald Tablet's claim that what is within mirrors, what is without, though no physicist would be comfortable with the comparison. Fractal geometry demonstrated that self-similar patterns repeat at every scale of nature, from the branching of rivers to the branching of neurons to the branching of galaxy clusters, a structural echo of the Hermetic principle that the macrocosm and the microcosm reflect each other. Epigenetics revealed that experience can alter gene expression in ways that are passed to subsequent generations, suggesting that the body carries a form of memory that is not encoded in DNA sequence alone, but in the way that sequence is read a biological parallel to the ancient claim that knowledge can be inherited not through texts, but through something subtler, something woven into the fabric of living systems. None of these discoveries prove the Emerald Tablet's validity. They do not need to. What they do is create a space in which the tablet's language, once dismissed as primitive mysticism, begins to resonate with frameworks that the modern world takes seriously. The resonance may be coincidental. It may be the kind of pattern that the human mind imposes on unrelated phenomena because it cannot tolerate randomness. But it may also be something else, a signal that the principles encoded in the tablet are not relics of a pre-scientific age, but descriptions of something fundamental that different eras access through different vocabularies. The traditions that speak of an eighth civilization do not describe an empire. They do not describe a technological utopia, or a political order, or a return to some imagined golden age. They describe a shift in the quality of attention, a civilization that does not merely accumulate knowledge, but integrates it, that does not merely build power, but understands the consequences of wielding it, that does not merely observe the patterns of the cosmos, but recognizes itself as a participant in those patterns. This is not prophecy in the dramatic sense. It carries no date, no deadline, no spectacle of fire or flood. It is quieter than that. It is closer to the way a season changes, not in a single moment, but through an accumulation of small shifts that, taken together, produce a world that is no longer what it was. The Emerald Tablet. If it is anything at all, may be the simplest possible description of what such a shift requires. Not new technology, not new institutions, not new beliefs, but a recognition felt rather than argued, experienced, rather than theorized, that the inner world and the outer world are not separate domains, but two expressions of the same underlying structure, and that the health of one depends on the health of the other. Whether Atlantis existed as a physical place or as a memory encoded in myth, whether Thoth was a historical figure or a symbol for a type of knowledge that no single person could contain, whether the Emerald Tablet was carved from a green stone in a temple before the flood or composed by a brilliant mind in medieval Baghdad, these questions may never be answered with the certainty that the modern mind craves. But the thread that connects them is not dependent on any single answer being correct. The thread is the persistence of the message itself, its refusal to disappear despite every force that should have erased it. Libraries burned, empires collapsed, languages died. Religious authorities condemned it, scientific orthodoxy dismissed it. And still the words returned, copied by anonymous hands, whispered in private rooms, rediscovered in every generation by people who had no connection to the generation before them, but who recognized in the tablet's compressed language something that felt less like learning and more like remembering. The ancient teachers said the tablet would reappear when the world was ready. They did not define readiness as technological achievement or political stability or material wealth. They defined it as attention, the willingness to look at the patterns that have always been present and to see them perhaps for the first time as instructions rather than decorations. If that kind of attention is stirring now in scattered individuals across a world that is louder and faster and more distracted than any age before it, then perhaps the old stories were not wrong. Perhaps the knowledge does not return to the world in general. Perhaps it returns to the listener who is quiet enough to receive it. And perhaps that is enough. Not a civilization reborn in a single moment, but a single thread of understanding carried forward once more through the narrow passage between one age and the next into whatever silence waits on the other side. In 1936, when the locked chest was opened and Newton's private pages were spread across an auction table in London, the men who handled them did not know what they were holding. They saw stained paper-dense handwriting diagrams that resembled no branch of physics they recognized. Some pages smelled faintly of chemicals. Others were brittle at the edges, darkened by heat, from experiments conducted centuries earlier by hands that had also calculated the motion of planets. Among those pages, folded once and placed between two sheets of unrelated notes, was Newton's copy of the Emerald Tablet, a few lines of Latin in careful script annotated in the margins, with symbols that no scholar at the auction could fully interpret. The chest was divided. The pages were scattered across private collections. It would take decades before anyone understood that the man who gave the world the laws of motion had spent his quiet hours reaching for something those laws could not touch. The tablet's words, copied by the most rational mind of his century, passed once more into silence, carried not by flood or fire this time, but by the simple closing of a lid. We have followed a long thread tonight. It moved through ice cores and temple walls, through Plato's unfinished dialogue, and the underground tunnels at Saqqara, through the furnaces of medieval Prague, and the quiet forums where an anonymous manuscript appeared and then dissolved. The thread touched Thoth and Hermes Newton, and nameless alchemist stone circles in the Sahara and granite blocks in the Andes. At no point did it arrive at a conclusion, and that is not a failure of the telling. It is the nature of the material. What we have been tracing is not an argument. It is an echo, the kind that reaches you not because it is loud, but because the room has grown still enough to hear it. Much of what was described tonight may be coincidence. The flood myths may reflect nothing more than the universal trauma of living near rivers that overflow. The emerald tablet may be a medieval composition dressed in borrowed antiquity. The geometric precision of ancient stonework may be the product of patience and skill rather than inherited knowledge from a vanished world. These explanations are not weak. They carry the weight of careful scholarship, and they deserve the respect of anyone who values evidence over narrative, but they do not quite close the door. A narrow space remains not wide enough for certainty, but wide enough for the kind of question that does not demand an answer so much as company. It is the space where the pattern lives, neither proven nor dissolved, suspended in the same ambiguity that the ancient teachers seem to have considered not a problem but a condition of the knowledge itself. And perhaps that ambiguity is not something to resolve tonight. Perhaps it is something to set down the way you might set down a stone you found on a long walk, not because it is heavy, but because you have carried it far enough for now and the path ahead is soft and does not require anything in your hands. If there is a tablet, if there was ever a green surface that held the structure of the world in a few compressed lines, then it has outlasted every civilization that tried to keep it. It has outlasted fire and water and the slow erosion of languages that no living mouth remembers how to shape. It has outlasted the ages that understood it and the ages that did not, and it may be that its survival depends less on where it is hidden than on something simpler, on whether in any given age someone pauses long enough to notice that the echo is still arriving. That pause does not need to happen now. The questions will keep. The stones will hold their angles. The stars will continue their slow precession through constellations that were ancient before anyone carved their names. Whatever the tablet carried, whatever Thoth preserved or invented or imagined it, has waited 12,000 years according to the longest estimates, and it is patient enough to wait through one more night. So let the thread rest where it is. Let the names Atlantis, Thoth, Hermes, the unnamed alchemist in Prague, the anonymous author who vanished from the internet, let them settle, like sediment in still water. They are not going anywhere. They will be here in the morning if you want them, or they will drift quietly into the background of a dream you may not fully remember, but whose texture stays with you faintly like warmth from a sun that set hours ago. The night is yours now, traveller. There is nothing left to solve, nothing to carry, nothing to decode. Only the old ordinary mercy of rest, the body finding its weight, the breath finding its rhythm, and the mind at last allowing the long story to close its pages without needing to know how it ends.